In January 1952, a CIA memo from Project Artichoke asked a disturbing question. Question was, can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation? So this question defined the entire program. The CIA was not simply studying behavior control. They were asking whether it was possible to override the most basic human instincts, including, of course, self-preservation, the instinct not to kill, and the ability to resist commands that violate moral beliefs. Researchers explored whether a person could be programmed to perform actions they would normally refuse, such as assassination. And to pursue this goal, the CIA developed three parallel research tracks, which eventually merged into a combined behavioral control strategy. So we're at track one. To understand what the CIA was doing, you have to understand where the world was at that time, right? So it's 1950. The Korean War just broke out. American soldiers are being captured by North Korean and Chinese forces. And when some of the American soldiers come back, something is wrong with them. So there were prisoners of war who were making public statements that sounded nothing like themselves. Some of them would denounce America. Others would calmly confess to war crimes that they didn't even commit. And because of that, the term brainwashing starts to get thrown around, and it sends a big shockwave throughout U.S. intelligence. So at this time, the CIA's worst fear was that the Soviets might have found a way to reprogram the human mind, and America didn't figure it out first. And what followed behind was one of the most secretive, morally catastrophic, and poorly understood chapters in American history. So the CIA's behavioral research operated along three separate tracks simultaneously, and track one was about hypnosis. What the CIA documented about hypnosis is not at all what Hollywood taught you. And as early as 1951, a document titled Hypnotic Experimentation and Research outlined a staged plan where stage one is to identify individuals who could enter deep hypnotic trance states, and stage two would be to test whether post-hypnotic commands could be implanted and later carried out without the subject having any conscious memory of receiving them. The man who ran these experiments was a CIA intelligence officer named Morse Allen. So Mr. Allen had taught himself hypnosis. He was not a licensed clinician. He was really just a spy who had decided to learn how to control people's minds, and he also practiced on CIA employees. So on February 10th, 1954, Allen conducted an experiment that he documented in a formal written report that involved two secretaries who worked at CIA headquarters. Allen hypnotized the first secretary. While she was hypnotized, he told her to wake up the second secretary, who also had been put into a deep hypnotic sleep. And she was told that if the second woman could not be woke up, she would pick up a pistol and shoot her. So in Allen's reports, he says that the above experiment was quite successful. The gun had been secretly unloaded. Both women were told afterward that it was a training exercise, and neither one of them knew that it actually happened. This is a CIA officer's own handwritten documentation of an experiment in which a human who had never held a gun and had previously expressed a fear of firearms pointed a weapon at another human being and pulled the trigger while under hypnosis. Now, CIA researchers, drawing on the work of psychiatrist George Estabrooks, began exploring an entirely separate personality. Estabrooks had proposed that through deep hypnosis, it was theoretically possible to create a secondary personality inside of someone that the primary personality would have no awareness of. So the wet dream for the CIA at this time was finding an intelligence officer who could receive instructions, carry out a mission, and then return to their normal self. So someone who could pass a polygraph test because their primary personality genuinely had no knowledge of what they had done. Someone who could be activated by a specific trigger, which is a word, a phrase, a piece of music, and then return to normal life with no memory of what they had just done. And the CIA called this concept the Hypnotic Courier, and they took it very seriously. So the problems with hypnosis approach is, for one, limited susceptibility and the moral barrier. So with limited susceptibility, only about 20% of the population can enter a deep hypnotic state. And even smaller of a percentage of the population can reach the level needed for complex behavioral programming. And this made finding suitable subjects extremely difficult for the CIA. And the moral barrier is the simple fact that a lot of subjects would refuse commands that violated their moral beliefs. And researchers would repeatedly observe that subjects who would follow instructions initially, they will suddenly break the trance and then refuse commands involving harmful behavior. So to overcome this resistance, researchers began exploring chemical methods to weaken moral inhibition. And now we're on track 2, which is where we get into pharmacological control. So the CIA's Technical Services Division, led by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, and if I mess up that name, please forgive me. I'm going to mess up a lot of names throughout this presentation. But it was led by this scientist, or this chemist, and they began looking for a way to control subjects chemically. So Gottlieb, who some historians have called the CIA's Dr. Strangeglove, oversaw one of the largest covert pharmacological research programs in history. The goal was to find a substance that would weaken physiological and psychological resistance, break down personal identity, and make a human being infinitely more susceptible to suggestion. So they tested dozens of compounds, and some of them were well known and some of them were not. So the first one we get into is, of course, LSD. So the CIA became obsessed with LSD, which is known as lysergic acid diethylamide. And after learning that European researchers believed it could cause a temporary psychosis, a 1955 CIA report stated that subjects giving LSD became, in their own words, markedly more suggestible during hypnosis sessions. The CIA bought the entire global supply of LSD from the Swiss manufacturer Sandoz in 1953, and they brought it every single dose so that no one else could have it, pretty much. We also have Scopolamine, which originally it was investigated as a truth serum. Scopolamine produced disorientation, hallucinations, and extreme suggestibility. So it was frequently combined with other drugs in what researchers call cocktails, which was designed to chemically break down a subject's resistance before a hypnosis session. Now, this is a complicated name for this drug, but I'm just going to call it BZ. BZ is an incredibly potent hallucinogen developed by the U.S. Army. Its effects can last up to 72 to 96 hours, nearly 4 full days. During that time, subjects can lose their sense of identity entirely, become completely disconnected from reality, and experience hallucinations so severe that they cannot extinguish them from actual events. The CIA investigated whether BZ could be used as a memory erasure agent administered after a programmed act to prevent the subject from retaining any recollection of what they had done. Sodium pentothal combined with amphetamines. So this combination became known as narco-hypnosis. Pentothal lowered inhibition and resistance, and amphetamines kept the subject awake and physically functional. So together, these two drugs produced a state where a subject was highly suggestible, but still capable of purposeful and directed behavior. We'll move into track 3, which is sensory deprivation and personality erasure. So the third track of the CIA's behavioral research program was the most extreme one. So if hypnosis could program behavior, the drugs could dissolve resistance. So what if you could simply just erase the entire personality, like wipe it clean, and then rebuild it from scratch? And that was the theory of Dr. Donald Ewen Cameron. So Dr. Cameron was one of the most prominent psychiatrists in North America at this time. He was the founding president of the World Psychiatric Association. He had served as a judge at the Nuremberg trials, and then he went home to his laboratory in Montreal at the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University. He did things to his patients that were not entirely different from what he had helped convict others in the Nuremberg trials. Cameron's research was secretly funded by the CIA through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. His patients, many of them who were simply seeking a treatment for mild depression or anxiety, had no idea that they were part of a CIA-funded program. Cameron called his method depatterning. The idea was to break the existing personality completely before attempting to install new behavioral patterns. The process involved several stages, and all of them were happening simultaneously. The first stage was drug-induced sleep. Patients were kept unconscious using powerful sedatives, sometimes for 15 days, and even up to 65 days straight. They woke up only long enough to be fed and then sedated again. The second stage was electroconvulsive therapy. So at 20 to 40 times the intensity used in normal clinical practice, administered up to 3 times per day, and the convulsions were severe enough to cause injuries. The third stage was sensory deprivation. So patients were placed in isolation rooms wearing eye coverings and cardboard tubes over their arms to prevent any tactile sensation. White noise played constantly, and all sensory input was removed. Fourth stage is psychic driving. While patients were in these drug-induced, shock-addled, sensory-deprived states, Cameron would play them audio recordings, repeated messages playing for 16 hours a day for weeks or months at a time. And sometimes these messages were attempts to install new beliefs. Sometimes they were simply designed to reinforce the destruction of the old identity. Cameron's records show he largely succeeded in the destruction phase, but patients emerged from his treatment unable to remember their own names, unable to recognize their families. Some had regressed to infantile states, unable to speak, unable to feed themselves, unable to control basic bodily functions. Some reported that entire decades of their lives had simply vanished from their memory. He was unable to install new personalities into these subjects. A 1963 CIA Inspector General report noted that Cameron's research had not produced the desired behavioral programming outcomes, but described it still as something that was of interest. Dr. Cameron died in 1967, and his victims had eventually found out what had been done to them. So in 1988, the CIA settled a lawsuit brought by 9 of Cameron's surviving patients for $750,000 while admitting no wrongdoing. Many of Cameron's victims were never the same again. Some were permanently disabled. Some lost marriages, careers, entire portions of their lives. And almost none of them had known what they were consenting to. So by the mid-1950s, CIA researchers had concluded that no single method worked reliably on its own. Hypnosis alone hit the moral barrier, so subjects would just resist commands to commit any harmful act. Drugs alone were unpredictable, so the effects were difficult to control accurately. Personality erasure could destroy the personality, but they couldn't rebuild the personality. So they began combining everything, which researchers internally called narco-hypnosis, and this is how it worked. So step 1, you would put the subject through extended drug sessions to chemically weaken the subject's psychological defenses. And this could take days or weeks. Step 2, with the subject in a weakened state, they begin the hypnotic programming. This would be repeating sessions, reinforcing specific commands, stuff like that. Step 3, install a trigger, which is a specific word, phrase, or piece of music, or even a visual stimulus that would activate the programmed behavior when presented later. And step 4, after the programmed act was carried out, administer a memory wipe protocol. basically a chemical memory wipe using some type of drug, right, to prevent the subject from retaining any conscious memory of what they had done. So on paper, this was perfect. An assassination carried out by someone who genuinely did not know what they had done. But the question that the destruction of the MKUltra files in 1973 may have permanently prevented us from knowing is whether this ever moved from theory to practice. So now we look at possible real-world cases of hypnosis. In 1968, three of the most significant political assassinations in American history took place within months of each other. And in at least two of them, researchers who have spent decades studying behavioral programming have identified details that, to put it carefully, do not fit standard narratives. There are also some other questionable cases that we'll look into after this. So we look at Robert F. Kennedy of 1968. So Sirhan was convicted of the murder of Robert F. Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He remains in prison today, but his case contains a set of documented anomalies that have made it one of the most scrutinized in American legal history. So first, Sirhan consistently stated from the night of the shooting through decades of interviews and legal proceedings that he had no memory of shooting Kennedy. Not a fuzzy memory, no memory at all. The last thing he could recall was being in a coffee urn room with an attractive woman who offered him coffee. The next thing he remembered, he was being grabbed and restrained on the floor. Second, multiple witnesses at the scene described Sirhan, I don't know his name, as appearing to be in a trance-like state. So second, multiple witnesses at the scene described Sirhan as appearing to be in a trance-like state. One witness, as a former FBI agent named William Bailey, noted that Sirhan's expression was blank and his eyes appeared to be fixed and unfocused in a way that seemed inconsistent with a person who was consciously committing an act of political violence. Third, Sirhan's notebooks discovered at his home contained page after page of repeated, almost ritualistic automatic writing. RFK must die. RFK must die. Robert F. Kennedy must be assassinated before June 5th, 1968. The repetition, the lack of any broader political context in the notebooks, and the automatic quality of the writing are features that several forensic psychologists have described as consistent with post-hypnotic compulsion rather than ideological motivation. And fourth, Dr. Herbert Spiegel, one of the world's leading authorities on hypnosis at the time, evaluated Sirhan and concluded that he showed the characteristics of a person at the extreme high end of hypnotic susceptibility. He was, in clinical terms, an almost ideal candidate for deep level programming. And then there is the work of Dr. Daniel Brown. Brown is a Harvard-trained psychologist and one of the foremost academic experts on hypnosis and memory in the world. Over a period of years, Brown conducted more than 60 hours of hypnosis sessions with Sirhan. His findings, published in academic form, concluded that Sirhan showed evidence of a dissociative identity, a secondary personality structure that had been programmed through hypnosis, and that Sirhan may not have been the actual shooter, or may have been firing at a location that was not Kennedy's position while someone else fired the fatal shot. So the forensic evidence has long been contested. The coroner's report indicated that the fatal shot was fired from a range of approximately 1 to 3 inches behind Kennedy's right ear. Multiple witnesses testified that Sirhan was never within several feet of Kennedy and was in front of him, not behind. So no official investigation has ever fully resolved these contradictions. James Earl Ray was convicted of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis. He later recanted his guilty plea and maintained until his death that he had been manipulated by a man he knew only as Raoul, a mysterious handler who Ray claimed had orchestrated the assassination while Ray was used as an unwitting patsy. What most people don't know that is in 1999, the King family brought a civil lawsuit arguing that a conspiracy had been responsible for Martin Luther King's death. The jury deliberated for under an hour and returned a verdict in favor of the King family, concluding that a conspiracy involving multiple parties had indeed taken place. The verdict received almost no mainstream media coverage, though. Arthur Bremer shot and paralyzed presidential candidate George Wallace in a Maryland shopping center parking lot. What researchers have noticed about Bremer's diary was that it showed an unusual psychological character. Bremer had been stalking multiple political targets for months, but the diary contains almost no political ideology, nor did it show any coherent motivation. So, some researchers have argued that his diary sounded more like a narrative that was constructed to establish a profile after the fact and less like the writings of a man who intentionally committed a political act. So now we look at Frank Olson. Apparently, the CIA was not just testing substances on enemy combatants or volunteers, but they would also test them on American citizens without consent. Prisoners who didn't know that they were giving any drugs, mental patients, drug addicts in treatment programs, people who had no idea that they were part of a government experiment. Frank Olson was a biochemist who worked for the U.S. Army's Special Operations Division, which was a unit that worked closely with the CIA. In 1953, Olson attended a work retreat at a cabin in rural Maryland with several colleagues. Sidney Gottlieb was present. Without Olson's knowledge or consent, Gottlieb spiked his drink with LSD. In the days that followed, Olson became deeply disturbed. He showed signs of severe psychosis. He told his colleagues that he wanted to leave government work. And after that, he was described as paranoid, distressed, and unlike himself. 9 days after being dosed, Frank Olson fell from the window of a New York City hotel room on the 13th floor and passed away. The official ruling was suicide. His family never accepted that conclusion. In 1994, Olson's body was dug up, and forensic pathologists found evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull that was inconsistent with a fall from a window. The pathologist concluded that Olson had been struck on the head before going through the glass. No one was ever charged. The case officially remains unresolved. Now, here's something that almost never gets discussed in mainstream coverage about MKUltra. So this one is about a lady whose name was Candy Jones. Candy Jones was a famous American model and pinup star during the 1940s and 50s. She had basically just entertained troops during World War II, and at that time, she was genuinely well known to be a public figure. So in the 1970s, after she entered therapy with her husband, he started to claim an alter personality called Arlene. Under hypnosis, Arlene described being recruited by the CIA, being used as a messenger for sensitive information without the knowledge of Candy Jones's primary personality. And also, she says that she was being put through sessions of physical pain and psychological programming. Her husband documented hundreds of hours of hypnosis sessions in a 1976 book called The Control of Candy Jones. Researchers are still divided about it, but the timeline, the details she described, and the specific techniques she named align scarily close with what we know from the declassified MKUltra files. The CIA never confirmed or denied her claims. In the late 1950s, a 16-year-old Ted Kaczynski, entered Harvard University, who was also said to have a genius-level IQ. And while at Harvard, Kaczynski was recruited into a psychological study run by a professor named Henry Murray. Murray was a personality psychologist, and he did a study that was designed to test how individuals responded to extreme psychological stress and personal attack. And here's a fun fact. This study was also funded in part through channels connected to CIA research. All right. So participants were given code names and they were put through intense, prolonged verbal attacks on their beliefs, their values, and their self-image. They were connected to electrodes to measure physiological responses while they were told that sessions were philosophical debates, but they were actually being put through brutal, sustained humiliation, as researchers was described later on. Kaczynski's code name in Murray's files was Lawful. He participated for 3 years, and whether those experiments added anything to the psychological damage that eventually produced the Unabomber is something researchers, psychologists, and Kaczynski's own family have all debated. His brother David spoke up about noticing changes in Ted after his time at Harvard that were deeply troubling. Kaczynski himself, in his own writings from prison, referenced the Harvard experiments as a turning point, but the connection is documented. It is real, and it has never received the public attention that it deserves. So now we look at what modern science says about whether any of this actually works. So we look at hypnotizability, where research consistently finds that roughly 10 to 15% of the population, or the US population, are highly hypnotizable individuals. These people can enter deep trance states, experience dramatic reductions in pain, follow complex post-hypnotic suggestions, and in some documented cases perform actions that they later have no conscious memory of. But really, the bigger question is, can hypnosis make someone do something that violates their deepest moral beliefs? The most influential research on this question was conducted by psychologist Dr. Martin Orne. Orne argued that subjects in hypnosis experiments who appeared to violate their own moral beliefs were not actually losing moral control. They were just cooperating, because since they knew that it was only an experiment, it made them feel safe to follow through. But CIA researchers had a counter argument, and it is genuinely difficult to dismiss. So the questions lead you to think, or maybe it does, or maybe it doesn't. What about a person who had been drugged up for weeks? What about someone who had their personality erased, or even someone who had no memory of having received instructions? So in that context, the moral barrier might not function the same. So that theory has never been ethically tested, and it never can be. And the unanswerable question, it starts here, right? In 1973, the CIA director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of the MKUltra files, not the redaction, not the classification, the entire destruction of the files. And when he later testified before Congress about why he did it, he said that the files would have been deeply embarrassing. So not illegal, not dangerous, embarrassing. Wow. Wow. So the files were shredded. The program pretty much disappeared. But he did make one small mistake. So that small mistake he didn't know was that 20,000 MKUltra documents had been misfiled in the agency's financial records archive. So they were eventually discovered in 1977 during a routine government audit. And that's literally the only reason why we know what we know today. So think about what that means. Everything that we discuss in this video, every experiment, every drug protocol, every hypnosis session, every name, it comes from 20,000 accidentally preserved documents. And the program involved over 150 sub-projects. It operated across more than 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, and prisons, and it also ran for 2 decades straight. So here's the fattest question in this video. The fattest question, right? Can the CIA make you commit an assassination? So here's what we know for certain. The CIA spent over 2 decades and millions of dollars attempting to develop the capability of mind control, okay? That we know of, right? That we know of. They documented experiments where hypnosis was able to make individuals perform simulated acts of lethal violence. They tested combinations of drugs, sensory deprivation, personality destruction, and hypnotic programming on human beings, where most of them didn't consent to it. They theorized in detail about how a programmed assassin could be created and deployed without leaving any psychological trace. Okay, so here's what we cannot know, right? We cannot know whether they ever crossed the line from theory to practice. We cannot know whether the methods were ever combined successfully enough to produce a real world result. We cannot know whether any of the historical events we looked at tonight were connected to the program, or whether they simply appeared to be on the surface or not, right? The files that would answer that question do not exist anymore. And the unsettling thing is that we're left with the question that the documents force us to ask, but refuses to let us answer. And the CIA asked whether they could override human consciousness entirely, whether they could strip a person of their will, their identity, their most fundamental instincts. They never officially confirmed that they succeeded, but they also never confirmed that they failed. And for a program run by people whose entire profession is deception, that silence has to tell you something. It has to. This is a presentation that deserves more serious attention than it gets. The documents we discussed are very real. The experiments we covered are documented. The questions at the end are real, open questions that historians and researchers are still working through to this day. If you want to go deeper on this stuff, the church committee hearings from 1975 are publicly available. The surviving MKUltra files are accessible through the National Security Archive. Daniel Brown's academic work on Sirhan is peer-reviewed and published out there. I will also place a link in the description to a timeline of experiments and studies done in the U.S. dating back to the 1840s all the way up to the late 1990s that you can read for yourself. Now, I will tell you right now, some of the things that you will find in there will really bother you. It will. So I'm just saying, do as you please with it. But honestly, don't take my word for any of this stuff. Just go read the source material and see for yourself. Other than that, drop a comment below with what surprised you the most, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.